Okay, everybody, welcome to this webinar hosted by Compass and Elder Abuse Action Australia. Thank you for joining us wherever you are, and a special shout out to those of you who are joining us from Victoria. We know how hard this is for you, and we're very glad to see that the numbers are heading in the right direction at last. My name's Caroline Baum. I'm an author, a carer, and ambassador for the Older Women's Network in New South Wales. And I'm going to come to our speakers in a moment. But first, I just want to pay my respects and our respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we find ourselves, wherever we are today, and acknowledge their elders past, present, and emerging. Now, it's a really shocking statistic that it is estimated that 1 in 5 Australians will experience some form of financial elder abuse in their lifetimes. It is the most common form of elder abuse. It's a complex issue that involves financial institutions and legal jurisdictions. It's often a family matter that can start with something as seemingly innocuous as an adult child who has their parents' PIN number. Now, this week just coincidentally happens to be National Scam Awareness Week. And with that comes disturbing news that financial scams are up by 55%. And many of the most vulnerable targets of scams are older Australians. But scams are usually perpetrated by strangers. Today, we're going to focus on abuse by people that the victim generally knows, where the abuse of trust is one of the most painful and potentially shame-inducing aspects of this hidden epidemic, and one that often keeps it from being exposed. It's insidious. It often starts gently and gradually. As I said, a PIN number that may be misused, claiming a false carer's allowance, forging signatures, changing wills, but it can escalate to dramatic scenarios of so-called granny napping, which we may hear about later. I'm going to introduce each of our speakers, and then we will have a conversation about some of the issues. And of course, you are welcome to ask a question at any time using the Q&A function on your screen. And frankly, the more questions from you, the better. So our speakers today. Kay Patterson hardly needs any introduction. Kay Patterson AO is, of course, the Age Discrimination Commissioner and has been so since 2016, where she's been focusing on the rights of older workers, the blight of elder abuse, and finding solutions to the increasing risk of homelessness among older Australians. Brian Hurd describes himself as a maturing and passionate partner with Brisbane law firm CRH Law, specialising in elder law before many other lawyers were interested in this particular branch of the law. And that includes estate planning, disputes over wills, advanced health directives, incapacity and QCAT hearings, succession disputes, and mediation. He has seen it all. Christine Cupitt is the Executive Director of Policy at the Australian Banking Association, with a focus on protecting consumer interests and contributing to innovation and reform in banking. And Daniel Coase from FECA joins us from the Federation of Ethnic Communities Councils of Australia. He's at FECA after 17 years as a senior policy manager in ACT Health and set up the organization's response to diversity. So welcome to you all. Kay, if we could start with you, what are the major risk factors with financial elder abuse, and how much do you think they've been compounded by COVID?
There are a number of issues that increase the likelihood of elder abuse. One is isolation, people being on their own. The other area is an older person having someone younger coming to live with them. And we've seen tragically in the last few weeks during COVID, a couple of actually murders of older people when their grandson's been living with them and on drugs. So that's the extreme end of elder abuse. But having the pressure now with the cost of housing, of young people wanting to move back in with their families, or saying, you know, Mum, your place is too big, why should you be living here? We're struggling with our mortgage, and making a person feel completely inadequate. I think one of the other things, and I think maybe banking needs to have a look at this, but it's with, sorry, not banking, the governments need to look at the jurisdictions. They've actually changed temporarily signing of documents during COVID and making it easier to do it online. And I think that does pose a problem. Banking's actually sent out cards to people who haven't been normally using cards, and that's another issue that I think is important for them to access, but they're a bit more at risk because they're probably not the most IT savvy group. I think, oh, it's okay to give my daughter the PIN number, she'll go down and do my shopping. So I think making sure we educate them. So on the one hand, you're trying to help them, and the ABA has been trying to help people, encouraging the banks to send cards out to people who have only been using passbooks or checkbooks. So COVID's actually created some situations where you could see the likelihood of abuse increasing. Somebody who's financially or emotionally dependent on an older person can start suddenly to put pressure on them. And attitudes of entitlement. As I said, you know, you should move out, Mum, you've got a big house. So there are a whole range of things, and I'm sure Brian Hurd in his practice will have seen many more excuses and arguments and reasons why, you know, well, I've divorced and I'm trying to start another family, and look what you could help me by doing that. All sorts of pressure. The other thing is going into, I've heard talking to one of the banking customer service people. They said that somebody comes in and says, I need to take money out of the bank. And they're asked, would you like to go and speak to the bank manager? And they say, yes. And the bank manager says, do you really want to do this? But no, if I don't do it, they won't let me see the grandchildren. So there's blackmail involved as well. And that must be one of the most powerful motivators of an older person when they're told you won't see the grandchildren, because we all know how attached people are to their grandchildren. So there are devious ways in which people are abused.
That's right. And I have heard of cases from the public guardianship of people saying the trade-off is that I know that I am being financially abused, but that's allowing me to stay in my home, or, as you say, have access to my grandchildren. It's absolutely terrifying. Do you think, Kay, that women are more vulnerable to financial elder abuse simply because they may they live longer generally out of a couple, and so they may be the last parent standing that cops it from the kids or the grandkids?
I think there are more older women, of course, as you said, they live longer, but also when you're looking at the old, that's people in their 80s and 90s. Some of them have not actually handled money. They've left the workforce and they married, and their partner may have always managed money and managed things. So they're not as used to doing that, and so children can take advantage of that. So I think we may see some changes as the next generation, the baby boomers, come through, who've been more used to having their own money in their own account, maybe not even a joint account. So I think there are differences between the different age groups, but it's I agree that and the evidence shows that it's more women and more abuse of sons on mothers. But the federal government's actually funded a prevalence study, which the Australian Institute of Family Studies has been undertaking, and I've just been in discussions with them this week to see how it's going, and they've finished a large sample of people, looking at them, putting out questionnaires to try and look at what is the extent of elder abuse. Now, I think it will always be hidden. We won't ever get the true picture. But Canada and Britain have undertaken this sort of a study, and we're using World Health Organization data, which is most probably not very accurate for Australia. So hopefully we'll get a slightly better picture, but I still think it'll be underestimated.
Now, the other complicating factor in all of this is cognitive decline and dementia, which provides so many more opportunities. So how does that, that seems to just make it so much harder to kind of identify the problem?
Well, my training is as a psychologist, so I'm very passionate, interested in the area of cognitive decline. I have been talking to and working with a group. Macquarie University has just set up a new centre of excellence in looking at how we assess cognitive decline. And there are some lawyers involved and also neuropsychologists looking at, I may be able to make a decision about where I live. I may even be able to make decisions about spending small amounts of money, but I mightn't be able to make a decision about how my investments are handled. And I think we need, and I sort of think if you've got, 3 lawyers and 2 doctors and a couple of psychologists, you might get very different evaluations of capacity. And I think one of the things we need to be able to do more clearly, as we see more people getting older and more people who are living with cognitive decline, that we need to be able to assess it, because I think the worst thing is to take someone's autonomy away. And we do have a benevolent autonomy where, we'll stop people doing things. You can't go somewhere. And I had a case of a fellow who wanted to go to Queensland from Victoria to an Anzac Day thing, and the nursing home said, you can't go, it's risky. Well, we let young people go out on, bikes and skateboards, and I think older people should have autonomy and shouldn't have them taken away prematurely. And sometimes the excuse is either it's risky and you'll fall, or you mightn't find your way home. Well, I do think we need to be careful that we don't become overprotective of people in a negative way. But we also have to understand that some people haven't got the capacity to make some decisions.
No, and I think that what you've just said, it's so important to remember that word agency, to not make decisions on behalf of people that are still capable of making decisions to some degree.
I don't want to put words in Brian's mouth, but and I'd never do that, but I think he will stress that one of the ways you can protect people is to make sure they have their appropriate documents in place.
Yes.
And that they've been thought through.
Exactly.
That's another way of protecting people in terms of who's going to make decisions for them if they lose capacity.
And that is a perfect segue. So, Brian, that's exactly where I was going to go. Tell me about what you regard as the kind of essential documents and agreements that a family needs to have in place so that everybody is protected from themselves and each other in terms of the sort of underlying venalities that can surface under pressure. Can you just walk us through things like a power of attorney, enduring power of attorney, and a family agreement, which was something I did not know about?
Certainly, Caroline. As a lawyer, I'm a great believer in having documents in place rather than having conversations about what's going to happen or what should happen. In summary, those documents are an enduring power of attorney, not a power of attorney, an enduring power of attorney. And there is a difference. An enduring power of attorney is a power of attorney which continues on if you lose capacity, whereas a power of attorney comes to an end if you lose your capacity. So everyone should have an enduring power of attorney. They also need to understand that if you don't have one, it's a legal quagmire, because nobody, be it your spouse, your next of kin, your neighbour, your dog, nobody can make financial decisions for you. You are in a legal black hole. The consequence of that is someone in your family has to go off to a tribunal to get appointed to make decisions for you. That's the last thing you'd want to do as a parent, is force your children into some legal process because you failed to do something. The second thing is what's called, and certainly you can do this in Queensland, an Advance Health Directive. It's a document where you can give directions about the sort of healthcare you would or would not want should you ever lose your capacity to make your own healthcare decisions, including whether you do or you don't want life-sustaining measures. So the beauty of that document is that it speaks for you when you can't speak for yourself. It tells your enduring power of attorney what decisions you want them to make if ever you can't make those decisions. And these are really seminal decisions. In other words, should I live or should I die? It's hard to imagine a more serious decision to give to somebody else without the assistance of this document. The final one you mentioned was a family agreement, although I haven't mentioned the word will yet. But wills are really important too, because if you don't have one, that's another legal quagmire. But coming to the family agreement, there's no doubt that in response to our ageing population, in response to the aversion we have to the so-called home-like environment of residential aged care, and particularly during COVID-19, there is an increasing tendency for families to come together and start caring and supporting for each other. So older parents are increasingly moving in with their adult children, or vice versa. Adult children are moving in with their aging parents in order to provide care and support for them. Now, the reality is most people have an aversion to documenting legal relationships with their children. The last thing you'd think of when you sit round a table on a Saturday morning, have a cup of tea with your daughter is, Mum, why don't you move in tomorrow? And you say, yeah, no worries. And you move in tomorrow without giving any consideration to the implications of doing that. Lifestyle, financial, Centrelink, everything that comes with that really ominous decision, quite apart from whether you should do it or not. So documenting those arrangements, those caring arrangements, can be very important, particularly if you're on an age pension, because Centrelink has some strict rules about people moving in with other people. And you can actually jeopardise your pension if you don't do it properly. And the best way to do it properly is to do it in a document and do it with people who know what they're doing, as opposed to people who don't know what they're doing. Because those family agreements that aren't properly drafted can come undone and Centrelink can attack them, and people can actually lose their pension because of the nature of the agreement that was struck between the parties.
Brian, are there not also complicating factors? I mean, that was a very clear elucidation of how to get your house in order, but it's not that straightforward. There are risks associated, are there not, with the powers of attorney? They can be forged, they can be out of date. It's really important to know whether one has been revoked or not.
Correct. There's no doubt about it, that every legal device available to people, the recommendation is do it. The next recommendation is do it well. So, for example, with an enduring power of attorney, if you've got 7 children, you'd be stupid to appoint all 7 as your enduring attorney. But you'd also be stupid to appoint one of them and leaving the other 6 on the outer. So that's setting it up for failure. That's setting it up for family implosion, tension, stress, the squeeze effect between the children, where one is bequeathed with the power and the other 6 simply have to circle the wagon, as it were. So doing something properly as well as doing something is very important to prevent the misuse of it. There are all sorts of laws that could be changed to improve that. One of the difficulties, for example, with enduring powers of attorney is that there's no requirement to register them, unless indeed you want to use it to buy and sell property. Mm-hmm. What that leads to is that those people who have been appointed refuse to give a copy of it to somebody who's interested, such as another member of the family. So you have this isolation of the adult from the decision-making document, because there's no law which requires them to give it to somebody who has a natural interest in the document. I could go on for hours about the deficiency of the law in this area, but the reality is you need to spend money to save money. People who think they can do these sorts of things on the cheap, fine. If you pay nothing, you get nothing. What you will get is family implosion. So it's something you need to invest in. Investing in these documents, investing in advice on these documents, sounds like just pushing my barrow, but the reality is, unless you do that, the propensity for it to fail increases exponentially. Mm. And that's when families really go under and really implode, when you haven't done it properly.
And it's a little bit like, it strikes me, you know, Brian, that it's a little bit like the awful timing that most people only think about the funeral that they want for their loved ones when they're in a state of shock and grief and bereavement. And so the idea is to do this when you're calm and not in a crisis, not to do this when a family fight has already started. So what are some of the red flags that one should be on the lookout for? You know, there is this term, inheritance impatience, which is often called inheritance entitlement syndrome. We know that we're all living longer. It means that children are having to wait longer to inherit and maybe get a foothold into the property market. There are so many different sorts of new kinds of behavior that are coming into play as people live longer. So what are some of the red flags for you?
Well, one of the concerns I have is that sometimes people do the wrong thing by their parents and actually say they didn't realize they had. For example, can I give you an example of this? Recently, there were 3 children, adult children, who appointed the enduring power of attorney for their mum. Mum owned a very expensive house worth about $900,000. Mum had to go into aged care. She had lost her capacity, so the enduring power of attorney was activated. The 3 children decided they sell the house, and they then split the proceeds equally between the 3 of them. So Mum didn't get a look in. Now, when they came to see me, they said to me, we don't know what we've done wrong. And a lot of people hearing that scenario would say, well, what in fact have they done wrong? There are 2 problems. One is they've stolen her money. That's the first problem. Because she's still alive, remember, just because she's been assigned to an aged care facility is not a death sentence. She's still alive and it's still her house, it's still her money. But the second consequence was just absolutely calamitous. And that is she lost her age pension. Not only that, her aged care fees went through the roof. So there were two adverse consequences that these children had no concept of. Not even their gut told them that what they was doing was wrong, or there could be a problem here. They never gave it any consideration. That's what you call inheritance expectation or anticipation, because their attitude was, well, she doesn't need it. Let's just do it now. Let's bring forward her will making and say, well, we'll have it now, thanks very much, because that's what was going to happen anyway. So even apparently innocent missteps by miscreant children like this, they don't have the insight. Therefore, they don't have the ability to avoid making these sorts of mistakes. But that also raises another problem with this area, and that is the issue of language. Language, especially in the legal sphere. I mean, in the legal sphere, we talk about criminal behaviour. In this sphere, if you read many cases in this area of elder abuse, financial abuse, they soften it, they distort the conduct, and they call it bad behaviour because it's behaviour by a family member, not an outsider. Or there was a judge who said twice in his judgment, listen to this, he said the behaviour of the son who took $482,000 for his mother was cynically taking advantage of her. Not committing a criminal offence, cynically taking advantage of her, or shamelessly sponging on her. See, the language softens, it's euphemistically, softens the conduct. So it doesn't become criminal conduct, it's just bad behaviour. So the problem is the law doesn't take it seriously. And the law should, and there are lots of things the law could do to take it seriously.
Yes, I have heard lawyers say that they think inheritance entitlement syndrome should just be called theft. So I take your point. I want to come back to you about granny napping, but I want to move on, and we'll come back to you. Just before I come to Daniel, I do just want to mention that I spoke earlier today with Warramai woman Liz McIntyre, who works in senior management and policy in Aboriginal health and correctional sectors in New South Wales. And it was very interesting to get a background and an awareness of how you think about financial elder abuse within a First Nations context where there are different family dynamics, and also a completely different way, a different attitude, if you like, to the sharing of money through extended family and to anyone in the community who needs it. And we also discussed the nature of humbugging, that is financial pressure on elders. So this practice, Liz was saying to me, is generally uncovered through medical services where people come and talk about a physical problem that they might be having and have a bit of a yarn with a social worker. And so Liz was saying to me, who sadly couldn't be with us today, that service providers need to be aware that this is a problem where it may not be identified via a helpline or sort of the traditional methods that we're talking about at the moment. It's much more about face-to-face and grassroots kind of contact. So I just wanted to acknowledge that we'd had that conversation and that there is a sort of a different approach that needs to be taken in that context. And coming to different approaches brings me to you, Daniel. So I really would love some insight from you on how to address the issue of financial elder abuse in the CALD communities where cultural sensitivities can be significant additional factors or maybe misconceptions on the behalf of very well-intentioned people.
Sure. Of course, it's difficult to speak. So cultural differences are so specific cultures. This is going to be very generalised, and I'll just give that warning. But you're quite right. I mean, cultural norms and expectations can really confound perceptions of what constitutes mistreatment or abuse, and what we may see in our culture as somebody unduly influencing somebody may not be considered so in some communities. And I guess culture impacts in all sorts of ways. I mean, at its broadest level, it's kind of our tendency in our culture to place the individual at the centre of decision making, whether it's in health, patient-centred care, or disability in terms of notions of choice and control. So our focus on individualism is sometimes different from some cultural concepts of collectivism and families making decisions together. So culture also impacts on concepts of how we care for the elderly, impacts on family relationships, hierarchies, decision-making, especially with filial relationships. And all these things may conceal, as you said, abuse. It may not be evident to outsiders, and it can also inhibit help seeking, with often within communities a fear of shame and stigma. And I think there's also this case that there's gender implications here. In some cultures, women may have an inferior social status and are more at risk of being abandoned on the death of a husband, or there's traditions about how assets are distributed. There's very often a reliance on adult children to manage finances. Sometimes there's a power imbalance too, so the primary migrant, or the person who financed the migration of a parent, because that's quite expensive, becomes a de facto primary decision maker. Other factors, as we mentioned, of course, are language difficulties. When you talked about dementia, I think we're all aware that people who often speak English quite well will revert to first language in decision making. I'm thinking of the older European women from that first wave of migrants post-war often end up on the death of husband isolated because they've really been home focused. They can be isolated from community, family support. Their trusted family members or supports may in fact be overseas and not readily on hand. There are also cultural traditions about financial management practice, who does what, who's responsible, aspects of intergenerational asset transfer and how things are handed on. It's not quite as simple as wills. So all of this is quite interesting because we often hear in Australia, we don't need to worry about elder abuse with Cal communities because they have this cultural tradition of looking after their own and respecting elderly people. But it's worth pointing out, I think, that in countries of origin, factors such as globalization and urbanization are really impacting on traditional norms and practices. And it's particularly surprising, I suppose, in 2013, China actually introduced a law for protection of the rights and interests of elderly people. That actually lays out the duties and obligations of children, their obligation to visit parents, obligation for employers to grant such leave, and obligations how children must attend to their parents' spiritual needs and never neglect or snub elderly people. So China, which is, we all thought, is a culture that really does respect the elderly. The reality in terms of present day developments means there's been a cultural shift. And in our context, if you add in migration to that mix, it may result in traditional norms, practices, beliefs about aging and care of elderly being diluted in children of migrants who've been here some time. I think one of the crucial issues here too is in Cal communities, particularly with elderly women, a lack of financial literacy. Financial literacy may be financial matters with the responsibility of a husband. As Kay said, people often prefer personal interaction with banks, and online transactions may be more usually done by computer savvy relatives or children. And just generally in financing, we know that women as a whole often have less financial security anyway. They have lesser superannuation balances, and that's particularly true, I think, of this group. There's often hasn't been a way to attain financial independence, which makes what you have even more important. So I think
Daniel, can I just interrupt you? We're getting a couple of comments to say that your audio is very soft. So if you could speak closer to your microphone or boost the volume.
Okay.
Now that's much better. So that's great, because I'm going to ask you about whether you've seen positive outcomes as a result of the kind of approaches that you're talking about there, which are about education, financial literacy. Have you got any experience where you've seen anecdotally that this has been resolved in a sensitive way that is culturally respectful?
I think through our membership base, which includes ethnic community councils in states and territories, and who themselves have a lot to do with smaller, if you like, ethnic community groups, there's been quite a lot of work done on a local level. But I think on a broader level, it's really important, I think, that so often in our national response to these issues, the answer is to throw out translated mainstream materials. And we've seen the impacts of that in COVID recently, where the important step of consulting with communities, does this make sense to you? Does this respond to your information needs? That's often missing. I think there's a need to really sort of train support workers, in all sorts of contexts, who are coming in contact with these people, who might have the language and cultural skills to recognize and address indications of abuse. I'm aware of the efforts the banking industry is making, and in fact, we have a women's committee at FECA that is actually put this issue on their agenda this year. And there is a bank employee who's involved in these efforts actually on that committee, which is helpful. I think there needs to be real consultation with CAL community groups, you know, around these issues. And I think a really important thing, given what the emphasis Brian placed on documentation, is this is really difficult in these contexts because given cultural beliefs about decision making, we've got lots of work to do in terms of explaining to CAL groups the Australian concepts of enduring powers of attorney, advanced care directives. But like even on end of life care, very often there's a complete acceptance that it is not my responsibility to make decisions for myself. That's up to my children. So all those concepts, advanced care directives, substitutes, supported decision making, all make sense to us, but can often be alien concepts to, you know, culturally, which need explanation as to why that would be a good idea. And I think the big gap is really, you know, really dedicated financial literacy programs for low income, particularly in these groups.
Well, of course, Christine, that's where you come in. I know that the CBA launched a brochure for its over 55-year-old clients in 2018. I think it was called Safe and Savvy, which the ABA then white labeled to all the other banks. Can you just talk a little bit about the role of banks and banks' increasing concern and awareness of this problem and what the banks are doing about it?
Thank you, Caroline. Yeah, certainly. Banks recognise that elder financial abuse is an insidious and very serious form of abuse, and in many instances a crime. So the banking industry really believes that it has a role to help support its customers and make sure that appropriate safeguards and protections are in place, and also complied with where the customer has taken steps to put in place their own safeguards. Safe and Savvy is a fantastic resource, and the focus of Safe and Savvy is really around giving people the information to set up their own safeguards and protections at a time when they are able to. In addition to the very important documents and legal arrangements that Brian explained, there are other things that can be done practically to improve safeguards. Things like putting in place your team, whether it's your network of doctors and other community supports, learning about scams and bulletproofing yourself against the risk of scams, understanding how they work and how you can protect yourself, and also giving older people information about elder financial abuse so that they themselves can recognise if it's happening to them or a friend or a family member. So that is a terrific resource. It's available on our website and through a number of bank branches, including all of CommBank's bank branches.
There are other things that you mentioned when we were talking yesterday, like when we were talking about managing your own finances, such as putting a threshold on withdrawals.
Yes, that's right. So, you know, it depends sort of on the offering of your bank, but many banks will have arrangements that you can put in place to put those sorts of transaction limits and thresholds on. You know, we do see circumstances where someone will provide their card and their PIN to a carer, for example, while we would never recommend or suggest that, there are things that you can do, like keeping a low balance in that account, and putting in place those kinds of thresholds and transaction limits in that scenario. And
about third-party signatories, is it good to have somebody else who needs to be involved in being a signatory on an account?
Well, it would depend on the customer's particular circumstances and the other legal arrangements that they have in place. But I think the most important thing about any kind of third-party signatory arrangement is that the customer themselves, the older person, understands what it means and what they're putting in place. And banks certainly have a role to help customers understand the effect of putting in place arrangements like that.
And of course, it is much harder with the current older generation because they are not necessarily making that transition automatically to digital, and they have been used to going into a branch, and obviously at a branch someone may spot that they are doing a transaction under duress, or that they're withdrawing a much larger amount of money than they're used to if they're a regular customer. So I presume that as we become a fully digital community, a lot more has to be done that can be perceived presumably through technology, like the blockchain, which can identify irregularities in patterns of withdrawal?
Oh, look, absolutely. I mean, I think if the broader question is, how do you identify signs of financial abuse outside of the branch context? That there is a lot that banks can do. From a fraud perspective, transaction monitoring is very sophisticated. And banks are thinking about how, and putting in place arrangements to use that same technology to monitor for these sorts of irregularities. The other thing is that there's a good deal of training that goes into call centre staff. A lot of transactions can be done over the phone. A lot of older people use phone banking. And certainly in terms of the issuance of the debit cards that Kay described earlier, most banks took the approach of ringing their customer and explaining why they would be getting this card, how to protect themselves, what to do with their PIN, and having that one-on-one conversation with the customer to prepare them for that coming their way.
I've got a question here that's come from someone who's watching, who's a terrific advocate for elder abuse, having been a person who's experienced it herself, Maria Berry, who says, "Hi Chris, is the Australian Banking Association and Bauer Media partnership to promote the elder financial abuse campaign still being promoted?" Because obviously Bauer are not.
That's right. So in terms of the ads running, as far as I'm aware that the ads aren't running at the moment, but the fundamental work underpinning that advocacy campaign continues. Kay is very closely involved in that, as are a number of other older people representatives. So that work continues. We have seen some positive steps from the Commonwealth Attorney General in terms of announcing the Register of Powers of Attorney, and we continue to advocate for those harmonisation changes as well. But it is certainly not the only work that we're doing. The work on the ground through things like Safe and Savvy is just as important. Likewise, our banks, recognising some of the deficiencies around powers of attorney, have just updated their own industry guidelines or guidance on how to record and properly act in accordance with enduring powers of attorney when they're provided by their customers. So the legal advocacy that we were advocating for with Bauer continues, but there's also those practical steps that we're taking as well.
Okay.
Can I just make one comment too, that the CBA just a few weeks ago has actually produced a number of guides for people from other languages whose English is not their first language, and they're in very simple form, and I think they'll be ending up being hopefully white marked by the ABA. But and I have to say that the banks are doing a lot. I've spoken to a lot of the major banks and some of the smaller ones, that they're looking at how they can actually protect older people. I hope as the age groups go through and are more IT literate, that some of those problems will decrease. But a point at banks, banking is an incredibly important point, and I've made the point too. I'm on the Post Office Stakeholder Committee or Council, and as you can now go to the Post Office and deal with 75 banks rather than just the CBA, there's a real risk that people could be using those points. So I think we need to educate older people that they need to be very careful that people can have access more easily to their bank account, especially if they've got their PIN number, and it's not something you let people have very easily. Shouldn't have it at all. So I think, but I've watched in the last, I suppose, 4 or 5 years, considerable emphasis from banks, from lawyers, from all sorts of groups in trying to educate people about elder abuse. And I think just the number of people on today and the number of people who turn up at the elder abuse conferences indicates there's a much greater interest. I have been working with the banks because Anna Bly and I are absolutely convinced we should have a one document. It is impossible, but for those watching today, the Victorian Public Advocate, and if you go to the Victorian Public Advocate website, there's a book there called You Decide Who Decides, and it was federal money was used to try and help people understand the different things. Brian hinted at it when he was talking about, well, in Queensland we do this. because it's not the same in every place. And some people have enduring documents, and some people have powers of attorney linked in with enduring documents as one document. It's all in that book. It indicates how necessary it is to have one document, so we're all talking about the same thing. But in the interim, if you're in Queensland and you're trying to look after your mother in Victoria, it does help to be able to get to that book and say, oh, we need to make sure for mum that this happens. And, you know, I think we really need to understand that people often don't have, an old person doesn't have a child living in the same state. And here we've got all these different rules. So that book's incredibly valuable. You decide who decides.
Thank you.
That's what Brian was saying. You know, if you don't decide who decides, somebody else will decide for you.
Daniel.
Chris, in terms of the conversations you were saying that happens when people ring up an individual, could we assume that banks have processes in place to have access to interpreters where that's required?
That's right. So particularly the major banks have very strong arrangements. In fact, while they do have arrangements in place, we've also had some really important feedback from our consumer advisory panel about being more deliberate in terms of arranging for interpreter services when they're required, and in particular being much more cautious about having a branch staff member or a staff member be the interpreter, and banks are being very careful about making sure that they put up the right sort of safeguards to make sure that when there's a financial decision being made, there's a more independent interpreter available.
Brian, can I come back to you and this term granny napping, because that illustrates the need for a sort of consistency of jurisdiction across state borders. Can you just explain what granny napping is and why it occurs? And are you seeing that kind of extreme behavior increasing? You're mute. You need to unmute. For some reason, you've muted your...
The reality of most cases of elder abuse is it's a case of exercise of power and control. That's the motivating force. So that can often mean the best way to control an older person is to physically control them, which means taking them away. And I had a case last year where there were 5 children. 2 of them were appointed the enduring power of attorney for mum. She was quite wealthy. One of the other children, who was not appointed, visited one day from Western Australia and stayed for about 3 or 4 days. Next thing they found out, mum had been spirited away to Perth in Western Australia. The purpose of that was she obviously had received legal advice before she spirited mum away, which told her that even though mum had done an enduring power of attorney in Queensland, that Queensland enduring power of attorney would not be valid in Western Australia unless someone applied to a tribunal in Western Australia to recognise that Queensland enduring power of attorney. Of course, no one did do that. So that left the daughter in Western Australia to be able to go and take her mother to somebody, a JP, and have her sign a West Australian enduring power of attorney, which she then used to defalcate all these funds from her mother's bank account before anyone realised. So she was a very well-informed abuser, and as a consequence was very successful in the process. And unfortunately, the other parties were less well-informed, somewhat ignorant, understandably, because their concern was to try and find her originally. But in the end, that's called granny napping in its classic form. It's all about control, isolation, and the ability then to do things that this woman particularly did. Can I just raise an issue that Christine was talking about in terms of banks? Because clearly banks are right at the forefront here in terms of knowing or not knowing what's happening. Most financial abuse occurs through banks. Most financial abuse occurs by children in relation to their parents. Banks have been very good at raising consciousness about this issue, both for themselves, their own staff, and for the outside world. The more difficult question, however, is if banks do identify unusual transactions, what do they then do? What's the next step? Because if the next step is to ring up mum or dad and say there's been some unusual transactions on your account, and if mum or dad is incapable, that's a useless phone call. So next step, ring up the enduring power of attorney. Now, that's probably useless too, because they're the ones taking the money. So, next step. Who's the next person that you report your concerns to in order to effect some recourse or action? What happens, Christine?
Well, Brian, you've raised a really important point, and a key limb of our elder abuse prevention campaign was to ensure that in each state there was an appropriate mechanism for banks and other service providers to, in good faith, escalate suspicions of elder financial abuse. We know that in a number of states, particularly Queensland, there are agencies that are able to take or to receive those allegations and have various powers to investigate them.
That's the only one in Australia.
Right.
That has that power.
Yes, okay. And in terms of our advocacy, we have particularly advocated for the Queensland model to be adopted because of those investigative powers. We actually had the Queensland customer advocate meet with the ABA Council to explain the breadth of her powers, and as a result, reports to her office in Queensland doubled, in the ensuing months. But certainly utilising those reporting mechanisms where they are available, as well as continuing our advocacy for a kind of good faith reporting mechanism.
So what do you do outside? What do you do outside of Queensland? Who do you report to?
Well, in some circumstances, it will be the police, and then the bank has to sort of work through the various privacy considerations and limitations on the information that they can provide. But certainly the police. Otherwise, other community sector supports if they are known to the bank. Like, for instance, if the customer is being represented by a financial counsellor.
Brian, I wanted to ask you about something that another lawyer who works in this area had said to me, which was a suggestion to extend the forfeiture role as a disincentive. So, for example, the rule says at the moment that if I kill someone, I can't inherit from their estate. If we extend that to cover financial elder abuse and we publicise that, would that have a deterrent effect? It is actually it's applied in 8 jurisdictions in the United States.
The answer is undoubtedly yes.
Right.
They have this very elegant expression in America. They don't call the forfeiture rule, they call it the slayer rule. So slayers get nothing if they've been the cause of someone's death, and yet they are also a beneficiary of that deceased person's will. So bringing that forward into the elder abuse concept, I think, is a fantastic idea. In Spain, there's a law which says if you haven't supported your parents during their life when they needed to be, you will be disinherited from their estate. Now put that in your pipe and smoke it. How would that apply in Australia? A positive duty on children to support their parents. It's all over the country, in many countries, I should say. So that's the next step in terms of elder abuse, is addressing the responsibilities of children towards their parents, as opposed to trying to deter them from actions against the interests of their parents. But that's another.
Very hard to demonstrate or prove that. That's a whole other sort of ball of wax. We've got a question here from Shahan Murray, who says, has Brian seen any success in families using succession mediation to enable open discussions about end-of-life planning and family agreements?
Undoubtedly, and the answer is yes. So many Australian families suffer what we call the C change. That's not SEA, that's capital C change, crisis change. In other words, they react to crises. So they have to get together when mum dies and say, what did mum want in terms of her funeral, for example? Raising the concept of death is a very important aspect of discussion with your parents. It's hard to confront. Mm-hmm. It's difficult, but it has to be done. Otherwise, these are points of implosion in families. If you don't discuss these up front and confront them, it will effectively, in many cases, implode the family later. So parents almost have a responsibility to raise it themselves. Children, let's sit down and talk about my death. Now, who's had a conversation like that? But that's really important, because if you don't confront that yourself, or your children confront you with it, you're then left with this unknown consequence about what's going to happen when you do die, when nobody knows what you want to happen. Ignorance is a real stimulus to family implosion. And
Absolutely.
Sharing these personal stories and personal desires is so important in bringing the family in. but also exposing the potential for disagreement and dispute, because it puts the wood on the children in terms of coming together and agreeing, as opposed to waiting their turn.
Now, when it comes to residential aged care, which is obviously the subject of a great deal of scrutiny and focus and attention at the moment, some nursing home managers have been reporting cases of children complaining about the facilities as a pretext to withdraw their parents from care to save money that they can then access. What can we do about that?
Well, you don't need a pretext to move out of aged care because it's still a free country, and you can go into aged care and then decide to move out of aged care. If you can't make that decision as a resident, your enduring power of attorney or substitute decision maker will make that decision. Now, that's their right to make that decision. They can take mum out in order to save money. And that's happening quite a bit at the moment because it does save money. Nursing homes are in an interesting position also because they often see elder abuse by families against their own residents. You know, the common scenario is where suddenly the residents' fees aren't being paid. Mm-hmm. They're stopped. Now, the answer is that one of the children has stopped it because they want to save money for their later life after mum dies. It's inheritance protection. So to that extent, that's what they will do. And aged care then has to go off and go to a tribunal and have the enduring power of attorney sacked, because the mandatory reporting regime in aged care doesn't cover economic abuse. It only covers physical abuse, assaults. So because it doesn't expand out to the area of financial abuse, it relies on the aged care provider to take action, and in many cases cost them money, to go off to a tribunal to have that child sacked. Now, that's a very unedifying thing for an aged care provider to do in relation to someone they're trying to care for, but has a child or an adult child who's doing the wrong thing by their own resident. So it's a quagmire and another deficiency in the law.
Yes. I'm going to come back to you, Kay, wearing your psychologist's hat. There's a question from Jenny Blakey. What do the speakers suggest to do to tackle the inheritance impatience attitude?
That's Jenny, I should say, I know Jenny, it's a very challenging thing to change attitudes. I think that sometimes people feel that their parents owe them the money because they didn't do the right thing by them when they were younger. I think there's a lot of anger associated with it and entitlement. I feel strongly that people need to protect themselves, and you can write quite detailed requirements into your enduring documents. You may choose that, for example, I have my enduring document can't be released until two of my friends who are both doctors, who are independent of my family, decide that I haven't got capacity. You can, Brian's a lawyer, I'm not a lawyer, but I think we don't actually think carefully enough about how we can actually protect ourselves or involve somebody else. So, you know, my person has my power of attorney might be fantastic at doing everything but deciding where I live. Mm-hmm. And I don't want that decision to be made by that person. Now, I think that changing people's behaviour, as Jenny's asked, is really very difficult. I don't know how you change people's sense of entitlement. You see families doing the right thing, and I've said to the banks, for example, we could have some protections for older people. We had a case when I first got into this job of a woman who was going to have coffee every day, as they do, to read the newspaper for free. Well, when you were allowed to in Victoria, go and have a coffee, and sitting there reading their newspaper. And I'll just tap your card for you, Mrs. Smith. Tap the card, $50 every time she went for a cup of coffee. Oh, it's raining. I'll go down and get you some cash from the bank. And she was taking bits of money out. Now, I think if you had a card where your power of attorney, and your financial power of attorney in this case, we all get a message, you such and such has been spent, and you think, oh, gosh, they've noticed I've been out on a spending spree. You get, have you spent money? And if you have, that's fine. If not, you need to call the bank or cut off your card. Well, you could have a thing that said, if I've had to top the card up more than twice in a fortnight, you can set the algorithm. I get a message to say that's happened on mum's card, I would have picked that up. And so I think there are some other measures that we put in place, because there are families who want to protect their parents, and it's hard, and to protect their parent from another sibling, for example. So I think I'm not sure how you change. If Jenny's got the answer to how you change people and stop them from abusing their parents, I'd love to know.
What you should do is audition your children before you appoint any of them. Sit them down and get them to audition for the part that they're going to play in your later life.
I think of that as a King Lear scenario, which could have fatal consequences. Not
really. It may be, for example, and I have in my family 2 people who would be making decisions for me. One thinks that you should depart this world when you become a bit had it, and the other one thinks you should hang on forever. I'd like somebody who thinks about in between, but I don't have people who think. And I think that's, and the audition, I mean, Brian puts it in a very funny way, but I agree, you know, we agree a lot. We agree to disagree sometimes. But I think to say to someone, you know, if I were ill in hospital with COVID, for example, and they want to intubate me, would you want me just to be kept peaceful and not coughing my heart out? And I'm 93, when I'm 93, and they say, nah, we want you to stay here, we want you to keep going. You think, maybe they're not the right person. So, you know, the audition is a funny way of putting it, but I think it's right to sit down and talk about, so you know which person you'd like to make that decision.
That does also, you know, that does presume that you've got someone, you know, that you have children or that you have relatives. And I think that there are a lot of people who have really to scratch their heads to ask themselves, who would I burden with this sort of responsibility? But that's a whole other theme.
I've had a case like that. I was at a function up in Tamworth with Seniors Rights New South Wales, Info Bingo, and I'm stunned when I go to those, how many people say, I didn't know I could revoke my power of attorney. I think if somebody leaves a lawyer's office and doesn't know that they could change their power of attorney, they think they've given it forever, it's appalling. In the ACT, if you write another power of attorney, it revokes it automatically. There are different rules in every jurisdiction. But this person came up to me afterwards and said, we have 3 investment properties. We're in our 80s. We've got nobody who we can give, to whom we can give our power of attorney. And my heart went out to them because I thought, you know, where do they go to find someone who will not rip them off and who will, you know, honour their wishes to give money to charity or whatever they've decided to do with their money. And I left feeling bereft from that meeting. I did actually contact that person with some ideas, but it's not easy, you know.
No. That's when
like a lawyer might be the right person, you know.
That's when I suppose public guardianship steps in. Christine, I just wanted to ask you, we have a question here from a financial planner who has expressed concern about institutional financial elder abuse, that is specifically focusing on the use of reverse mortgages and the impact that this negative equity situation will have on future options. My understanding is that most banks are not offering reverse mortgages anymore. Is this product still being underwritten? And can you just give us a bit of an update on thinking about that?
Yeah, thanks, Caroline. So in terms of the numbers of reverse mortgages that are being written, it is tracking down quite significantly. So the last data I've got from APRA is 2018, but nonetheless it shows over the prior 6 years a decline of 22% in reverse mortgages that were outstanding, as well as a pretty significant decline, 17% in the amount owing under reverse mortgage arrangements. So certainly the trend is that reverse mortgages are being provided less and less frequently. You know, like any sort of major financial decision, reverse mortgages need to be approached with caution, and, you know, the appropriate advice should be obtained before entering into one, particularly around those sorts of things like, you know, effectively running out of money. There are some threshold protections in terms of no negative equity, but it can leave people in a situation that they didn't expect if they live a lot longer than they thought they would. But the other thing I will say though is that we have had some limited feedback from seniors groups about, for a very small cohort of people, the utility of a product like this. In particular, where they are older, they do want to stay in their home because of family connection or another reason. And this product gives them the money to fund the improvements to their home that they need to stay in there, or alternatively bring paid care into the home. So I wouldn't write them off entirely, but approach with caution. The numbers tell the story in terms of fewer and fewer reverse mortgages being written. But, you know, like all of the issues that we've discussed today, it's really about giving people as much information as possible so that they can make informed decisions while they're able to.
Well, as I thought, this hour has completely flown by, and we have been absolutely deluged with questions from people who are watching. I think we could do a whole second session on this, which would be sort of more advanced, if you like. What we will do is we will put some FAQs together, and they will be on the Compass website and also on the Facebook page. So watch out for those. I'd just like to thank Kay, Chris, Brian, and Daniel. And just remind everybody who's watching that if you do need more information on financial elder abuse, please do visit the Compass.info website. A recording of this webinar will be posted on Compass.info next week. We'd also like to recommend that you read the new report, 7 Years of Elder Abuse Data in Victoria, which has been produced by Seniors Rights Victoria and the National Ageing Research Institute. And of course, if you or somebody you know needs help tackling elder abuse, call the National Helpline, which is, just hold it, Kay, one moment.
There, just there.
It's there, yes, it's exactly, that's right. It's just by Kay's head, but I'm going to say it anyway, 1-800-353-374. That's all from me. Just to say thank you very much for your attendance today, and great numbers and great questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all. Stay warm, stay well, wash your hands, wear a mask.